Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to do one of those clickbaity videos and elaborate on the differences between an inexpensive sword and a more expensive sword. And frankly, I've made this video before, but I've gotten a little better with the camera, and a lot of people have joined the channel since I did this one last, so it bears repeating. Anyway, I have a Ronin Katana right here. It's about $130. It's their entry-level stuff. I've reviewed it. I will link it in the description down below. I like this sword. Incidentally, this is another sword I like, one that I use a lot for training. It's an Evolution Blades Motohara Tensho. It might have a different name on their website, but it's about $2,000 general ballpark for this sword. So those are the two that I'm evaluating. I thought these would be good examples to talk about. One, because they are two swords that I like. Again, I've reviewed both of them favorably, and they're similar. They have similar aesthetics in terms of black Ito, white Samegawa, black gloss, and then they're also mono steel blades made from different steels with a bohei. So they have some similarities, and I think will serve as reasonable examples, at least for what I have around, to showcase the differences between inexpensive and expensive swords. So anyway, on with the show. Again, first I'm going to talk about kind of bit bobs, build quality, and then I'll move into using them and my thoughts on that. So anyway, fittings. I usually start at the kashra, but this is basically gonna apply to all of the fittings, and so I don't have to harp on it. There's a build quality difference. The inexpensive fittings on $130 swords tend to be, if they have details on them, they tend to be muddy. They tend to look like casts or molds that have been used a lot. A lot of the details on historical Japanese fittings are very precise. They have a unique art style to them, and they're very, very intricate, or at least can be. And most of the fittings in the $130 price point just look like moon cast shadows of that if they try to include it. So the fittings on this Ronin Katana are in that range. They're not bad for the $130 price point, but they are muddy, and you see imperfections in the casting. You see areas that were sanded off to avoid some of those imperfections in the casting, and that's about it. Further, the expensive sword at $2,000, we're still not in handmade, hand-engraved fitting territory. They're just better cast fittings. Some of them might be hand cut out. There might be some handwork involved, but generally speaking, you're not looking at terribly elaborate, intricate carved fittings. Those are regrettably even more expensive on swords to implement, or can be more than $2,000. The high end for this whole blade could easily be spent on a set of fittings that have that kind of intricate metal work on them. So you tend to get better cast fittings. That's, I suppose, the point I'm trying to make. I can make out clean, consistent lines. I don't see casting failures or imperfections to the same degree. This is maybe the worst part of the example here, in that this Tensho blade right here is more or less a horn fitting on the end. And while I can say that it's well executed and doesn't have chips and lines up well, it doesn't even have a fitting. The Fuchi up here does, and it's well cast. So the same would apply to the Suba, if it's on there, the Habaki, as well as any ornamentation or furniture that's on the saya. The Shirodome, the little washers that tend to go in here, are a little better quality. The Kojiri and all the other furniture pieces tend to be the same. In fact, generally, everything is elevated. That's the point of this video, but what you tend to see more specifically in differences are the casting tends to be more precise. You have a clearer vision of what it's looking at. It tends to be a more accurate representation of the historical fitting that it's trying to emulate. If I go to the other differences from the fittings, there's the transitions, how it lines up on the fitting here. And a lot of the inexpensive swords tend to be a little bit bunchy towards the kashra down here. That's where the knots tend to be, and if they misjudge how much material they need, then they or don't make the kashra long enough, or the handle long enough, it tends to get bunchy down here, and they might wrap it an extra bit. That isn't the case on this one, at least not necessarily, but you can see that it's the perfect size. All of these, the lines in the Ito are perfect and uniform. The diamonds are uniform. On this one, the diamonds wander a little bit, and it bunches up a little bit towards the end. Sometimes you can get bunching up towards the Fuchi as well, though that is more rare. Other bits to note is that the diamonds tend to be very smooth and consistent on a higher end sword like this one, and you tend to not have them waver around the handle as much. They might wander a little bit in terms of where they're placed, and they certainly are a little bit in terms of different size. Ito as well, you can see that if I press on this with my fitting, or with my hand, not my fitting, it moves around a little bit. This is, incidentally, for $130 sword, something that I would say is good. This is a good level of movement in this price category, in that I can displace it a millimeter or two, but it doesn't give me the impression that it's going to loosen up or fall apart anytime soon. This one, however, with the same pressure or a lot more pressure, I can't displace at all. What that does for you in terms of tightness of Ito: one, they might come unraveled over time. It's less likely if the ito is extremely tight. Two really tight ito makes this object feel solid in your hand. It gives you good purchase, and it's not something that you can necessarily see from a video, but how it feels in your hand, how secure it feels, how much control over you have over the weapon is certainly aided by having very tight ito, on top of it being structurally better. So anyway, you have a little bit, not a little bit, significantly tighter ito, and it's better tied. Underneath here, there's Samegawa panels, this white stuff underneath the diamonds, and here it's accentuated by some lacquer that's been put in and then washed off, presumably, that really highlights the quality of the skin. The nodules are brought to your attention by that contrast. Here, there's no such contrast material built in, and the nodules are significantly smaller. As a side note, my son is crying right now. He doesn't care that I'm recording YouTube videos, so if you hear him in the background, apologies. Contrast, again, if we move up to the Fuchi, no transition here. Again, sometimes that happens, but not necessarily so bad on either one. I'm talking about two swords that I happen to like, and I think the Ronin Katana generally represents a pretty darn good value for $130, and I think the Evolution Blades is a fantastic sword for $2,000 and also is an excellent quality piece. But neither one of them have a lot of transition here. There's no significant pronounced ledges. If I move up to the Suba, this one has been damaged in the past and was once dropped, and so it bends rather than breaks, so at least I know that. The Ronin Suba tends to highlight a few other things, though, and that there's like finger paints on here, which is what I tend to see in swords of this price point. If there is painting on the Suba, it tends to be poorly done. Historical fittings have, you know, sometimes gold or silver or various alloys of gold and silver with different patinas, and they're really intricate and beautifully well done. And when they're painted on $130 swords, I find it to be, I don't know, it just looks muddy, and it doesn't really accurately represent what it's trying to. Some people like it. I personally don't. I prefer fittings that are simple. Even on this really expensive sword, you can see that this is a style called tsukashi, I think, which is basically just like an iron fitting that's been cut out. And I prefer this. It's simple, easier to execute, and even on a higher end sword, I would rather have something well done like this than more garish and sloppy like this. But you can get, and I have seen swords in the, you know, roughly $130, sometimes $250 range that have fittings that are simple, and maybe I would say on par with what I see on the Motohara piece, or at least not that far behind. I'm going to talk briefly about the Scabbard here. So the Saya does a lot of different things, and in appearance, frankly, they don't really look that different. They're both black gloss. If I move it around in the light, they don't necessarily have a lot of ripples or imperfections or failures or anything like that. The Motohara's had some because I've banged it on the floor a few times. But anyway, they don't, at first glance anyway, look that different. What you might be able to see on the Motohara that isn't present on the Ronin is that it tapers. So it starts somewhat thick, and then it tapers down to a thinner piece towards the bottom. That's not always something you get at $2,000, but it's present here. By contrast, the Ronin Katana piece is basically one tube. It doesn't change in shape or size. It doesn't have horn fittings at the end of it. The kurigata area right here, this little nub that sticks out and holds the sageo, this cord wrap piece. The shiridome within it are of a cheaper quality. The sageo is of a cheaper quality, and this is made of wood versus likely horn over here. So there's a difference in materials. Further, if I look at the koiguchi area up here, the Ronin has no horn components on it, like the Motohara Evolution Blade does, and they certainly look different at if I look at them from the inside area. The Evolution Blades has a different construction where it's wrapped in horn, and then basically the wood bits stick out like they're supposed to. The Ronin is painted to not look bad, but at the same time the construction is not necessarily the traditional or better way of doing it. The other bit to note with Scabbards is how they sheath. So this one glides in like it's on rails, and if I hold it up to my microphone here, you're probably not hearing it a whole lot. It's not terribly raspy. And if I rattle it around and try to get the tip to bite in somewhere, it doesn't. It just slides right in, and is a training tool that's very helpful. It's very quiet to draw, and it glides in very easily, and it's built in such a way that it's harder to screw up. And if you do, well, I guess it can cut in if you initially put it in wrong at the mouth area, but generally speaking, it's a little bit quieter. By contrast, the Ronin piece over here is a little noisier. So you can hear a little raspier, and if I don't put it in right, it can snag on things inside. Now, this is also for $130, I think, an excellent training tool. It's not a bad sword by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't rattle. The tension on the area right here on the Koiguchi is about right. As a training tool, this is not a bad thing for $130. But at the same time, it's certainly louder, and it requires more more memory to not snag it somewhere on the inside that's open where it necessarily shouldn't be. It's still a decent sword, but at the same time, it just doesn't draw, it doesn't sheathe as smoothly, and it's not as nice to train with. Obviously, it's nicer on your wallet, but not nicer, not nicer in practice. Another component, the Habaki. You can notice there are some slight differences between the two. One is brass with a raindrop pattern. One is brass, the Ronin Katana is brass. The Motohara is copper with a raindrop pattern. There's a whole bunch of different Habaki that are out there, but there's more to just the material that it's made out of. The shape on the Motohara is better, frankly. It has more depth to it. The Habaki on the Ronin is not bad, it serves its purpose, but it doesn't have the same level of artistry. It doesn't meet the blade in the same way, and it's also just kind of a mass-produced piece versus, I believe, Motohara is making these individually to the blade. If they're not, they're doing a darn good job. Other details, the seppa on here, which are this little washer where the Habaki meets the blade, they are of a higher quality, and there's more ornamentation made from the same material on the Motohara blade. Anyway, it's just a better looking Habaki. Habaki should have some taper to them. They should have little feet that meet on the spine. That's present on the evolution blades. The ornamentation is certainly nice, but the thickness, how it touches the blade, where the hamachi, moonmachi are all correct on the Motohara blade, or at least closer to correct than they are on the Ronin Katana. At the same time, the blade collar does the job on the Ronin Katana. It's present, but certainly there's a quality difference and a detail difference as well. All right, I'll talk about the blade a little bit now. Well, first I'll draw some differences in the shape. One, the shape of the Ronin Katana is more or less the same shape as the many swords that you see out of Longchuan, China. And it's not necessarily bad. I don't know that it's based on any particular historic sword, but they all tend to be about 27.5 inches long. They might have a bohei on them with differential hardening, and those are the features of the blade. They're all about the same size, and it allows for economies of scale, I suppose you might say. But that is what this blade looks like. You'll see a lot of reproductions like it. By contrast, the Motohara is somewhat unique. I don't see another shape like this type of shape in other mass production sword companies. Motohara tends to be the only one that makes swords that look quite like this. Their other models as well have some uniqueness to them, some similarity to other competition cutting blades, but they tend to be at least a little bit more unique to Motohara. I'm sure either one of them may have been made historically, but they're at least more unique on the Motohara side. Polish level, the Ronin Katana is very simple. It's a mirror polish, and you can kind of make out the hamon, but it's a little bit obscured and hard to see, better in some lights than others, particularly sunlight. The same can kind of be said for Motohara, but you can more easily make out the hamon. The polish level is more consistent. If I look in the bohei, the polish area in the Motohara on the bohei is better than the Ronin. The Motohara also terminates. So when I say terminates, the bohei ends, and where it ends, it is more consistent and crisp on the Motohara. So that means somebody had to futz around with the file, do some more work on it to get it. The Ronin kind of tapers off into nowhere. The Motohara is very precise in how it terminates. The Yokote, both of them have a Yokote. The Motohara is a better execution on it. It's more defined, and then the Kisaki appears to not just be sanded, but burnished on the Motohara. Now, the Motohara is really a competition tool. It's not necessarily got the best artistic polish on it either, but it's more serviceable. I can certainly make out Zaz a little bit better. It's differentially hardened. I think it has character. It's a Suguha Hamon versus, a more, I don't know if this is Gnome or Natar, I'm not sure exactly, but a more erratic Hamon on the Ronin. Either one of them, I think, make striking appearances. I like the Hamon on either one, but I certainly think that it's easier to see on the Motohara. So anyway, those are some of the differences in the blades themselves. At least the differences that I can easily call out. If you want to see more differences, then I've linked it in the description down below, the reviews I've done on either one, so you can see in greater detail. From a user perspective, that's where I'm just going to chat a little bit. You'll again see in the reviews. that I have used both of them extensively, though not this specific Ronin one like it, a different RK series blade with very similar features. So the Motohara is just a better tool if you're trying to study Japanese swordsmanship. As I noted with some of the fittings, the way it locks into my hand is better. I feel more secure to it. I feel like I can index it better. The way it draws in the scabbard is smoother. The way it sheathes is easier. And as a training tool, it's a superior tool for it, but at the same time, at a significant increase in cost. The Ronin Katana is certainly a functional tool, and if you're starting in Japanese swordsmanship, it's a perfectly, well, I wouldn't recommend a live sharp blade to start, but if you wanted to practice with a live sharp blade, it's a functional and inexpensive way to get into it. I like that the tension on the scabbard is about correct. I like that it doesn't rattle a lot. I like that the ito is reasonably tight and doesn't make me feel like it's going to come apart. So those features are nice on an inexpensive sword to have, and you can get them obviously at at much less than the cost of the Motohara piece. Is there a big difference? Do they do anything differently? Well, yeah, if you're a practitioner and you recognize those subtle differences in your practice, then having a tool that better aids you increases your practice. It makes the practice more fun, easier, better, whatever you want to define it. A better tool allows you to do and work on the things you want at a superior level. Either one will function, and certainly there's the argument to be said about it's the swordsman in the practice, and a worse tool might aid you in doing that. I certainly disagree, though. I am not a particularly competent practitioner in Iaido, and practicing with a better tool makes me fight with the tool less, and that's basically my experience with it. So the Motohara, this one in particular, the Tensho, is one that I really like as a training tool. It's loud, so if I swing it forward, it has a nice wind sound, a swishy sound. I can swing it out there. I can easily tell if my edge alignment is good or bad. The Ronin is a little quieter. It doesn't have the same blade geometry, the depth of bohea. It doesn't. It's not as loud as a training tool. It doesn't index in my hand as well. Likewise with cutting. If I talk about the cutting, I've cut a bit with this Evolution blade now, mostly pool noodles. I haven't done a lot of mats, but it's a competent cutter. It's a very easy cutter, and it's very forgiving. And if you're doing competition cutting and that you're trying to get very precise angles, then having a blade that is sharp and kind of more geared towards that is a boon. It helps you do those things better. At the same time, the Ronin Katana is not a slouch in cutting. It's certainly a capable blade, but it's not going to be the same in terms of performance when you talk about doing tamashigiri specifically. If that's your aim, then having a Motohara, not necessarily this one, they make different geometries that are very purpose-built for tamashigiri. It's almost not fair. They are the most effective tool to almost do that job. The Ronin Katana is capable of doing it, but it wouldn't be a fair comparison. It's just they're much better at cutting tatami. Now, other things, it may be a different case, and I haven't pushed my Motohara or Evolution blades to failure. I haven't done anything intentionally to try to make it break, but I can say that I have done that to the Ronin Katana RK series. I've pushed a number of them at this point to failure, and they are very robust for $130. They cut into things, sometimes they bend, but you can bend them back. But for all the normal stuff, pool noodles, water bottles, tatami mats, they seem to do the job just fine. They're relatively inexpensive, and that means that you can throw some bad cuts in there, potentially bend a blade and bend it back and not feel too guilty about it. In contrast, if you nick a staple, or in my case, I cut the neck of a water bottle and bent my other Motohara blade, it's a real bummer when you bend your $2,000 sword or cause edge deformation, where on a $130 sword, it's a lot more palatable. So there's also that to consider. And again, it's not a bad tool. I have really put the Ronin Katana stuff through its paces, and they have impressed me in terms of the capability that a $130 sword is capable, or at least the resilience that a $130 sword is capable of having. It's very surprising, and we're kind of lucky to live in a time where stuff like this is available for $130. It's cool that you can buy a sword for that amount of money, and it's as durable as it is. Anyway, like I said, I've evaluated two swords that I like, so that's why this contrast might be interesting. So that brings me, I guess, to the differences in if I think they're worth it or not. Now, to me, yes, I'm very happy I have the Motohara blade. I have two of them. I use both of them for training. They each have their own pros and cons. I certainly think that the extra money is worth it, but I'm a person who, A, is very, very interested in swords. It is my hobby, my passion, my side project, the thing I blab about on the internet and talk to people ad nauseum about if they will listen. And so If you have similar levels of passion, then sure, it might be of interest. I also study Japanese style swordsmanship. As a training tool, it is excellent. I've been at it for longer than my skill level would indicate, but having a tool that is very effective to do that makes me enjoy training more. So yes, it is worth it for either of those two reasons. If you're a collector, or maybe somebody who just wants to have one that's nipped and tucked and is the best version that you can get out there for $2,000, then I think, again, the Evolution Blades pieces, the Motohara pieces, offer a lot for that. You don't necessarily get folded in some of the traditional elements that made a katana special, but if you want a katana-like sword made from modern materials that is nipped and tucked and an excellent training tool, then I think they, again, are worth it if you're a buyer at, with those preferences. However, if none of those are you, then no. No, it's not worth spending your money on it. If you're not going to train with it, if you're not going to do any of that kind of stuff with it, I don't know that the Motohara is going to be an order of magnitude more durable than the Ronin Katana piece. If I go smack either one of them into the croquet stake of doom, both of them are going to chip and damage and break. And so it's not a magic sword. It just does some things better. It likely might hold an edge a little bit better. It's probably going to be a little bit more forgiving to bending, given that it's made out of L6. But it's not a super sword. It's not going to cut through a tank or do anything wildly better if the things that I've already mentioned aren't worth it to you. So $130 sword is still a very competent sword. It still looks like a sword. It still cuts. You can still have fun with it. It's still very durable. And again, it's certainly worth it if you find those things to be of value. But if you do not, then no, it is certainly not worth it. You could spend that money on things that you hopefully would enjoy more. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I think, again, either one of these swords have impressed me. I really enjoy the Evolution Blade Motohara pieces. If people ask me, hey, what's some of the best swords out there for the money? In the high-end category, you've heard me steer them that way. That's what I train with. I made a video about my favorite swords, and the Motoharas are in there. You can watch that. I will link that in the description down below as well. The Ronin Katana stuff, though, again, is excellent for the money. If you've got $130 to spend, you want a functional sword out of it at the end of the day, they do that. Are there some concessions that you make? Absolutely. But at the same time, you have a differentially hardened blade with a cool looking hamon and something that is reasonably nipped and tucked for the money, and that the tension on the saya is good. The ito isn't particularly loose. And the fittings, it's real semegawa, and it doesn't rattle in the scabbard and all of that kind of stuff. So there are some nice things that this particular one has done relatively consistently over the lines that or the examples that I've reviewed over time. Anyway, I've babbled on long enough. Hopefully it's been interesting in talking about some of the contrast between an inexpensive sword and a more expensive sword. Let me know if it was helpful, and maybe I'll do another comparison of some other swords. That's all I got, though. Cheers. Thanks for watching.